Hello, everyone, and welcome to Slash Film Daily for October 17th, 2017. On today's show, we're going to be taking a look at a bunch of news, including how Guardians of the Galaxy 3 will kickstart the future of the MCU. We got the official title for the Han Solo movie, so we'll talk about that. Netflix has announced how much they're going to be spending on content for next year, and it's insane. And William Shatner has been pitching a way for him to appear in Star Trek Discovery, and I have some thoughts on that. In the mailbag, we'll be taking a reader question about the importance of box office numbers, and at the water cooler, Ben will share his thoughts on Hamilton, which he saw in L.A. Joining me today is Ben Pearson.
Hey, what's up?
And Hoai-Tran.
Hey, everyone.
Guys, before we get into today's show, I have a couple corrections to go over, both of which are for me things I either said incorrectly or stupidly in the past week of the podcast. So I'd like to just put it out there. That's that tends to happen sometimes. Tyler Smith pointed out regarding Gambit's release date, which is Valentine's Day weekend. I kind of noted that was kind of strange and a weird time to put a comic book movie. Well, it worked out for Deadpool, so I guess I wasn't thinking of Deadpool as a Valentine's Day movie. Something I probably should have looked into before saying on the podcast. And another thing I incorrectly mentioned, we were talking about Tim Burton or directors getting credit for movies that they're not responsible. And I mentioned that Tim Burton didn't direct Corpse Bride. He was the co-director of Corpse Bride. What I meant to say was he didn't direct A Nightmare Before Christmas. So yeah, those are my corrections. Let's now all stroll over to the water cooler because Ben has seen Hamilton at its run in Los Angeles. I have not seen the show. I have not even heard a song from the show. I really don't know anything about Hamilton other than I love Lynn's work on Moana and obviously Force Awakens. But
yes. So, HT, have you seen Hamilton or heard the soundtrack?
I haven't yet, and I'm also in the same boat as you as before you went to see Hamilton. I've been trying to stay away from the soundtrack as much as possible to get a fresh experience of the show.
Interesting. So I don't want to pull this into another spoiler conversation because you guys have been talking a lot about spoilers on the podcast in recent days, but that is the exact same approach that I took to it. I went into this unsullied, as it were. I spent 2 years avoiding every single song, everything, and it was tough to do with the people that I follow on Twitter who are obsessed with the show and constantly quoting it and all of that stuff. It was very a lot of people are like, yeah, it wouldn't be that difficult to avoid all references to Hamilton, but you don't follow the people I follow. So it was pretty tough, and I think it paid off because it was an incredible experience. It's weird to talk about because it's been so long since the show came out and debuted and sort of became a phenomenon. It sort of feels like really old news at this point. So it's like, oh, I'm the jerk who's just like, hey, you should go see this because it's great. You're like, yeah, no kidding. That's what everybody's been saying for years and years. But it really is incredible. And the music is just, it's like next level stuff. I don't really want to say too much about it because I assume a lot of people haven't had the opportunity to see it yet. And if they're, approaching it in the same way I did, I don't really want to say too much about. You
did know the kind of the premise of it, right?
I knew that there was something about not giving away a shot, and it was about Hamilton, and it was all the songs were rap songs, and that's all I knew. Like, I knew it was about,
and also
Alexander
that the cast
Hamilton.
was diverse, a diverse cast playing.
No, I didn't even know that.
Oh wow!
Really? Wow, yeah. You stayed away from that.
Yeah, so it was incredible. Like, just walking in with that level of non-information and just sort of being blown away like that. I was just really trying to preserve the experience of like imagining what it must have been like for the first people to go in to see that show, in previews before it became like a big phenomenon or whatever. I just wanted to sort of try to have that for myself. And I think we managed to pull it off. So I will say briefly, and I'll write about this in the water cooler with later on in the week with a little bit more detailed thoughts about the show itself. But just briefly, I recently went to Boston, and I also watched 1776, the musical movie that stars William Daniels, who's the actor who plays Mr. Feeney on Boy Meets World. He plays John Adams in that movie, and I think that 1776 is from maybe the 70s or the 80s or something. And I watched that movie for the first time recently. So all of my, I guess, recent experiences about the early days, learning about the early days of America really informed my viewing of Hamilton and sort of enhanced that experience of watching that show. And because otherwise I would have gone into it without having given a second thought to the founding fathers and all of that stuff since, a history class that I probably had in high school or something. So if you are planning to go see the show and you know nothing about it, I would say maybe, watch some other stuff, some sort of extracurricular, loosely related, adjacent, history-related kind of stuff, just to sort of fill in some of the gaps and give you a little bit more appreciation, because it really worked out well for me.
It feels like, at least from the little I know of it, it feels like you kind of have to know what happened to appreciate their take on it, because it is a take on it. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not the story, it's a version of the story.
Yeah, I mean, it does a really good job of laying out the basic elements, but it sort of references a couple other historical figures that I wouldn't have really given much thought to otherwise. So it's, just a little bit of things like that where it sort of enhances the overall vibe and going into it fresh. I would definitely recommend if you have managed to stay spoiler free for it at this point. But yeah, it was really great.
And I should say, since we have talked about spoilers and people are probably wondering, why have I stayed away from Hamilton? It's not that I don't want to see it. I want to see it. It's expensive here in LA, and I've been entering the lottery with no success. I might just have to spend the money. But the reason why I've avoided it is I kind of find when you go to see a Broadway musical that you're going not because of the story, but because of the songs and the performance. Mm-hmm. And I feel like in that scenario, me listening to the the music from the show, it does function as a spoiler. It does spoil that experience. I feel like that's different than plot points in a movie, but
yeah,
I know
I'm in the same camp as you. Yeah, I'm in the same camp as you because I feel like if I listen to the soundtrack, I won't enjoy it as much without having watched the show, just because I'm not getting these songs in context with the story. So it may be a really great soundtrack with great songs, but I don't think I'll get like the full experience I would have of watching the theatrical show.
Yeah, and Hamilton is an interesting, I guess, exception maybe to that rule, because every single word in the whole thing is part of the soundtrack. A lot of musicals will have, spoken sections in between big musical numbers, but it's like every song on the soundtrack, which we bought right afterwards because I was like, man, I got to listen to this over and over again.
Wait a second. So is the soundtrack
the entire thing? Yeah, it's the whole show.
Mm-hmm. So it's like Les Mis.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, maybe I will check it out then, because it is a little bit of the context. Like, I don't listen to movie scores before I see the movie, not because I'm worried about them ruining things, which, by the way, they have in the past. I remember episode 1, I looked at the movie score, and there was, I'm not sure if there's a postmortem on episode 1 spoilers, but there was Qui-Gon Jinn's funeral was one of the titles that John Williams put out there on the soundtrack, and that was spoiled for me, weeks before seeing the film in theaters. But that's not why I don't listen to movie scores. It's because I want to see them in context of the film before I listen to them on their own. For the same reason HD outlined. But let's get into the news, because we've already gone, 9 minutes on Hamilton, which I don't think people were expecting us to do.
Sorry, guys.
It's fine. Let's get back to Marvel, guys. Guardians of the Galaxy 3, we know that James Gunn has been saying that was going to kind of kickstart, 20 years of film storylines for the MCU. But what we didn't know is where Guardians of the Galaxy 3 would fit in the timeline. We still don't have a release date. Ben, we now know that it's going to kickstart Marvel's Phase 4. What do we know?
That is correct. So recently, some headlines have been going around about a statement that Kevin Feige gave in an interview with Uproxx, where he basically was talking about how the two Avengers movies are going to be the conclusion of an unprecedented 22-movie continuous story that the Marvel Cinematic Universe has been building toward. And a lot of people have sort of misconstrued those comments into thinking that that means that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is coming to an end. And that's not exactly what he's saying. He's just saying that this particular specific story that they've been telling of the Avengers forming and, you know, dealing with the Infinity Stones and Thanos and all of that stuff, that is coming to an end. And we know that Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is going to be one of the movies, or perhaps the movie, to kick off Phase 4 in the MCU. James Gunn sort of had to deal with a lot of people asking questions about what all of this means and is the MCU coming to an end and all of this stuff. And he's basically on Twitter, he said, no, read Kevin Feige's quotes and not the static around them. It's the end of one long story and the beginning of another. And one of the films that will kickstart the new story will be Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. So, that sort of, as Peter mentioned, aligns with what we've heard about Guardians Volume 3 so far, that it's going to sort of expand the cosmic side of the Marvel Universe and introduce a bunch of new characters and set up, you know, where the MCU is going to pivot after the events of Avengers 4.
That certainly sounds to me that they're going to be going more cosmic in the future. You know, there's only so many times that Earth can be in danger, and it seems like, you know, this next, not just Phase 4, but, you know, Phase 4, 5, and 6, I'm making this up in my head, it has to be something bigger and grander. I mean, with all sequels, you have to get bigger and grander, or that's, you know, the Hollywood, at least, what tends to happen. But I think it's smart of them to go more cosmic with the future. HT, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think it's interesting that it is going more cosmic, and I do welcome that expansion of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But I think we've reported previously that the Spider-Man Homecoming movies will also play a huge part in Phase 4, and there's no way that those stories can go quite that cosmic that like Guardians of the Galaxy can do. So I wonder how they're going to balance sort of that more world-expanding stories and more surreal stories with the day-to-day life of Peter Parker.
Yeah, I would not be surprised if they end up splitting it sort of in a half and half kind of way, where half the movies take place on Earth and then half of them are out in the outer reaches of space. But we'll see how they decide to go forward with it.
And we got a bit of unexpected news on the Han Solo movie. As the movie has wrapped production, we now have a title for the film, which is not so surprising. HT, you wrote this for Slash Film. What do we know?
Yeah, so Ron Howard posted on Twitter today a video announcing the wrapping of the Han Solo spin-off movie. And with that video, he announced the official title for the film, which has remained untitled for the past 2 years since it was first announced. And that title is, drumroll, Solo, a Star Wars story. So that's in line with a lot of the anthology, or the one anthology movie that we've had so far, which was Rogue One, a Star Wars story. So it looks like they're going to be keeping that up with all of the standalone Star Wars movies that we're going to be getting in between the sort of Force Awakens main trilogy. So yeah, this is big news. We expected it to be Han Solo, a Star Wars story, but it looks like it'll just be his chosen surname.
Ben, do you have any thoughts on this title announcement?
I mean,
what does this tell us that we don't know about this movie?
I know that's the thing is, like, I guess, and wasn't there all this discussion a while ago about Bob Iger talking about whether or not that was his real name, and then there was some clarification of that, like, yes, that was actually his real name, but Iger didn't really know. He just misspoke there. So,
yeah, Bob Iger said that we would find out how he earned the name Han Solo, which some people took as like, oh, that was not his given name. But yes, we don't know.
And now that sort of makes me wonder if like the clarification to that was actually a cover-up. If Iger really did know what he was talking about, because just concentrating on that last name. I don't know. I'm trying, guys. I'm trying to dig into this as much as I can, and I think that that might be the best guess that I can come up with. Is maybe there is something to that name that that Disney doesn't want us to know about quite yet.
A screenwriter on Twitter, Daniel Kunka, who I know, commented that George Lucas named a character Solo, who literally learned to not just care about himself, and everyone in 1977 thought that was okay. And that's something I haven't really thought about, even though I've thought about George Lucas's really on-the-nose names for people like Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker, and you know what I mean, like,
yeah.
But yes, I'm wondering if the name could be retconned in some way. Who knows?
And we also know it's like a big ensemble cast too, so you would think maybe with just concentrating on the word Solo that it might be more about him, but it seems like with all the people that we know are going to be in this movie, that there's a lot of story spread around to a bunch of different people. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what that balance looks like in the final film.
Moving on, Netflix has announced that they might spend upwards of $8 billion on content in 2018. That includes 80 original films. Ben, you wrote this up for Slash Home. What do we know? That sounds like a lot of money.
Yes, after spending $6 billion in 2017 on content, Netflix has decided that they're upping the ante, and yeah, it's possible for them to spend between 7 and 8 billion next year alone, which is totally insane. 80 original films. I assume a lot of those are going to be sort of produced in-house, but a lot of them are probably going to be acquisitions from film festivals and stuff like that as well. But $8 billion is $1 billion more than what Ted Sarandos, the chief content officer of Netflix, previously predicted that the company might spend in 2018. So to be $1 billion off, that's a pretty good problem to have. If you're like, we're just going to throw an extra bill at it, it's going to be fine. So they've got a lot of money to work with, and they've been growing their user base, even as Amazon and Hulu have been stepping up their game. Disney has its own streaming service on the way. Apple is going to be getting into the original television content space very soon. So Netflix is doing whatever they can to ensure that the user, the subscribers that it has now are going to keep returning to Netflix as a source of entertainment because of Netflix original content. That's really where they're putting all of that money, or as much of it as possible. They do have some, multi-year deals still in place as far as like licensing, acquisitions, and stuff like that. But a good amount of it is going to be going to original content, and that is definitely the future of Netflix as a company. They know that, largely because of them and the success of other individualized streaming services, these other studios and companies have realized that the value in having a centralized place for that kind of content, and it's just going to get more and more splintered from here. So Netflix is putting their money where their mouth is. I mean, they cite the acquisition of Miller World and their deal with Grey's Anatomy and Scandal creator Shonda Rhimes as sort of two pillars of the direction that they're heading. Working directly with the content creators instead of licensing the shows or whatever from outside third company parties and stuff like that. So Netflix, man, that's why they're raising that price, the price for some of the pricing tiers that HT talked about recently on the show. That $8 billion has to come from somewhere.
Yeah. Let's play a little bit of the game here, guys. HBO, how much money do you think HBO spent on content in 2017?
Do you know the answer?
I do. HT. What do you think?
Okay, so I remember that the Game of Thrones episodes for the next season will cost $15 million each. And that's just one series, but I'm sure that's the most expensive that they have. I don't know, maybe 50 million?
Well, you got to consider that this includes all content, so also movies. Acquiring movie rights. Ben, do you have any idea?
I mean, I would say...
I'll say that HT was very low.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
no,
have no idea. I don't know where to guess.
I would say maybe because HBO gets their movies funneled to them through Warner Brothers, which is like part of the same company, right? So I'm guessing they probably don't have to pay very much for that. I don't know, maybe 500 million or something.
$2.5 billion.
What?
We'll do one more. How about ABC? How much does ABC spend on content estimated in 2017?
It can't be more than HBO, right? Please tell me it's not more than.
It's more than
Is it
HBO.
more than Netflix?
Wow.
It's more than HBO?
Yeah.
Okay. 3 billion?
4
God,
billion.
yeah.
4 billion.
Oh my gosh.
NBC 4.3 billion, Amazon Studios 4.5 billion, but obviously Netflix is going to be the highest with 7 or 8 billion next year. But just goes to show you that's like that's something I found by Googling. So those figures might not be true. Don't send me emails saying that I got it wrong again. But okay, let's move on in the news. William Shatner is pitching an idea of how he can appear in Star Trek Discovery TV series that's now on CBS All Access. HT, you wrote this up for the site. What do we know?
Yes, so this was actually in response to a question he was asked by IGN about whether he would be willing to appear in the Star Trek Discovery series, which takes place roughly a decade after the events of the original series, in which he was a young 20-something Captain Kirk. So they would have to do a little bit of a timeline finagling to get this to happen, but he described an idea in which he would be able to make a cameo. And he compared this to his Better Late Than Never co-star Terry Bradshaw, who was a football legend and who's currently an aging one at that. So he says, and I quote, now he's older, his knees hurt, his back hurts. So here's this aging athlete who isn't what he was in his 20s and 30s, still carries himself grandly and has a sense of humor and all, but he's not the athlete he was. What would Captain Kirk be like 50 years later with the sagacity of mind, and yet the body doesn't do what he wants it to do? I mean, it's an interesting story. So I don't know if they could tell that story in particular in Star Trek Discovery, which does take place in the timeline.
Yeah, it takes place like 10 years before
after.
Or 10 years after?
Yeah, 10 years after the original events of Star Trek. And Michael Burnham is Spock's adopted sister. So there's like potential for crossover, but if there would be crossover, Kirk would likely not be played by William Shatner, but maybe he could be de-aged. There is a abundant use of de-aging technology these days, so who knows? But yeah, he seems to be interested in telling a story about an older Kirk, but I don't think that could happen in Star Trek Discovery.
Well, yeah, just to stave off the onslaught of emails that might come. I'm looking this up, and I think it does take place 10 years before the original series.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. It's 10 years after.
But yeah, you're talking about de-aging. That was the first thing that came to mind in my mind, because we've got so many. It seems to be like every fifth major studio blockbuster movie these days is sort of experimenting with this technology, and Star Trek Discovery is one of the most expensive shows on, I was going to say on television, but on streaming or whatever you want to call it. So they probably have the budget to pull something like that off. It's a matter of whether or not they would.
Do you think they have the budget of big blockbuster films, though? I feel like it's not quite up there, even though they're doing... How much was it like an episode? I
think it was like 8 million or something.
But that's for like an hour of TV. So you're looking at, the difference of like a $200 million film for 2 hours for 16 million for 2 hours. So it's a big disparity. A big what's the word I'm looking for?
Disparity.
Disparity. Yeah, there. And there's also the fact that like if they were going to have Kirk as older Kirk on the show, that there are movies that have storylines that I don't want to spoil, but make that impossible to happen. Well, I guess it doesn't make it impossible because this is sci-fi and you can do anything. But he was pitching J.J. Abrams this kind of idea to bring him in for when he was rebooting the Star Trek movie series, and J.J. Abrams was like, "You're you're nuts for not doing that. I mean, I'm putting, I'm making up words here, but I don't know. It just seems like, it would be cool to see an older Kirk, but the logic that you would have to put in the storyline to make that happen would be too much. It would just be too much. It would be like bad comic book writing to explain that, I think.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any way to explain how he's there?
I mean, I think he could play a completely different character than Kirk. That's the only way I could see him making an appearance on Discovery, just a cameo, but of a different character.
I guess they could do that. That could work, but I'm sure Shatner wants to be Kirk. So.
Yeah.
Okay, so that does it for the news. Not much news going on this week. It's been kind of a slow news week thus far. In the mailbag, we try to answer questions almost every day from you, the listeners. You can send the questions to peter@slashfilm.com. Please mention your name and general geographic location in case we mention the question on the air. Logan in Seattle writes in response to the studios complaining about Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic. He writes in completely ridiculous arguments, if you ask me, and trying to understand what the real culprit is against movies of quality. The reason I don't buy Rotten Tomatoes kills Hollywood thing is because of all the measurements Blade Runner 2049 should have made billions. It had a great Rotten Tomatoes score, great Metacritic score, and IMDb scores, great early buzz. So why does one of this year's best films now feel like a failure to the masses? Well, I think that's because our obsession with box office results. And he goes into, a friend, he mentioned on Facebook that people should see this movie, and the friend was like, oh, it only made this much money. It's probably not good. And I've seen that on Twitter before. I see, we not as a site, but as a society in the industry culture puts, I think, a great importance on box office numbers. So I guess the question, let's go through a couple questions here. Why are box office numbers reported everywhere? Ben?
So I think it's something that where it seems like it's only been in the past few years where this has really become a big thing. And I wonder if it's the studios sort of pushing this or just movie writers looking for a new angle on things. I mean, there's always been box office reporting, but it seems to have gotten more intense. And it seems like the gamification or something of Hollywood, where it's like the studios, I'm sure, love that all of these fans are basically playing fantasy studio executives and, paying attention to all of the money and all of that stuff. It's just like a different avenue for people to explore the entertainment industry and that side of the movie business. But I think, we'll talk about this in a minute, but the idea that box office numbers are an indication of quality is sort of crazy. But I'm not quite sure why they're reported on quite as much as they are right now. HT, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know personally any audience members who go to movies depending on their box office success. I know that it's become recently more used as a litmus test for the overall success of a movie based on the studio executive side. So I'm not sure if the audiences really take that into consideration, though.
I would disagree with that. I think that sometimes, it doesn't happen a lot, but sometimes there's a movie like Avatar that is doing, bonkers business at the box office. And there's kind of it's not just it's part of pop culture and I need to go see it. It's I need to go see this thing that that is making all this money. And I think it happens with, there'll be horror films like The Conjuring when that came out and was doing a huge business at the box office that people are like, oh, maybe I got to go see this thing. And it's a weird.
Or It earlier this year.
Yeah.
I wouldn't call that box office success, though. I would say that is down to word of mouth, which I wouldn't conflate with the two, because I think that word of mouth is a really powerful indicator and is a Like if people hear other people that they know saying that this is a great film, or they're hearing a lot of great buzz, then they'll go see it, but they won't exactly go to look up how well it's doing at the box office, I think. I think like the box office reports are more of a way of informing them that this movie is out, because people will, see it on the news or read it in the paper, like this is doing well at the box office. So people will think that sometimes equates to good word of mouth as well. So that was kind of a roundabout answer, but
yeah, we should say that this is obviously the movie business. So there are a lot of sites that, it's all about making a profit. It's not about making an artistic endeavor as much as people would like it to be. These studios are investing this money to get a return that is more than what they put into it. And, I guess every Monday we get all these sites, and actually it's become sooner. It's during the weekend. They know on Friday night what a movie is going to do for the weekend based on, historical and all that kind of stuff. Usually down to like $1 million. And, I think that's important from a business perspective, but I'm not sure it's important from our perspective, or from a fan perspective. It is interesting because we don't cover the box office results every week. We did do the summer movie wager on the site and on /Filmcast. So that was a bit of fun. We will cover box office when it's a big success or big failure. Like, when it was doing, huge business, we wrote about that because that was a film that we thought people should go see, and I think that buzz does help a little bit. And I think when something fails big time, like Valerian or whatnot, we talk about that as a major failure for that studio, and as not just as an artistic endeavor, but as for business. But okay, so let's get into what Ben was hinting at. Is the box office number an indication of quality? HT.
I don't think that's the case usually. What we see a lot of the time is that movies that do well at the box office are movies that are backed by the studios and are often made to be big hits. And often the case with that is we don't really get quality films. Over the summer, we kind of saw a sort of subversion of that with movies like The Mummy and Baywatch failing critically and commercially. But the case usually is like Pirates 5, that's going to be a guaranteed success. So a lot of money is going to be invested into it, and it's going to do really well at the box office, but the reviews won't be over the moon. So
yeah, and I think it has to do with them trying to hit the broadest possible audience. Like, so they're writing these films to not, be smart or clever, because that, for people that, don't want to think and go to the movies, or do you know what I mean? Or won't catch.
Yeah, they have it down to an equation, essentially.
Yeah. Ben, any thoughts on the box office being an indication of quality?
Yeah, I can't think of any time when that's really been true. I think it's just coincidental when it happens to coincide. But I think Valerian is a good example, Peter. I didn't even see that movie. I haven't got a chance to yet, but I know a lot of people talking about how ambitious that film was, and how, packed full of ideas, and like maybe Dane DeHaan's performance wasn't great, but it's still a movie worth seeing to make up your own mind about. And it just didn't really do very well at the box office. It might be a huge flop, but that doesn't mean it's a bad movie. There's a, and a lot of what HT was talking about applies here too, where the studios will, sometimes they have to sort of pick their horses, so to speak, as far as which ones they back and which ones they put the most money into the ad campaigns. A lot of times movies won't do well just because people don't know about them. They don't know that they're out, but that doesn't mean that they're bad movies either, So there are a lot of factors that go into the stuff, but I don't think if anyone tells you that box office is an indication of quality, I would certainly look at them, with some serious side eye.
Yeah, I think another question I wanted to get to was, if then what do box office numbers tell us about a movie? And, I'll provide my answer to this is I think they aren't unvaluable. They obviously tell us how successful a movie is. And I think in a way that tells us, is there an audience for this kind of movie, this genre, this, right now superhero genre, it's really huge. Right now, these R-rated horror films are really huge. That tells us about where, not just about us as a people, what the pop culture is craving right now, but also where we're headed, because the decisions that are being made right now in Hollywood are based on those box office numbers today. And, because it did huge numbers, we're going to see a ton of Stephen King adaptations in the future. We're going to see a ton of R-rated movies in the future, because Deadpool did so well. That's why we're going to see all these comic book movies that are pushing the R. And I think it's important in that way, because when you see the success of failure of things, like you see the failure of Valerian, that we're not going to get these ambitious sci-fi, space operas, other than probably Star Wars and that kind of, and what Marvel's doing. You kind of get an indication of it's I would say a thermometer of what is the culture now. Do you guys have any thoughts on what do box office numbers tell us?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think when it comes down to it, Hollywood is a business, and these box office numbers are a huge part of that business, because nowadays the movie industry and the movie landscape is kind of overtaken by high budget blockbusters, or either that or low budget indie movies, and you don't see a lot of the mid budget films where you see some more of that those creative leaps. But because movies are bigger budget and they're trying to reach a wider audience, we have to see, executives want to see whether that will be a success or not. And it's an indicator of whether we will continue to see those kind of films or sequels, for example, which is also a huge part of the movie landscape. So yeah, I completely agree with you, Peter. It's basically just gauging the audience interest in these kind of stories and these kind of movies, and continuing along that path of creative and narrative storytelling.
Oh, and one last thing, because we were talking about spoilers and this discussion will never end. A lot of people are pointing out that Blade Runner 2049, that the marketing for that campaign was so secretive, didn't reveal almost anything about the plot whatsoever, or the characters, didn't tell us anything. It just kind of presented a mood, that was the reason for that film failing. Is that true? Who knows? There's no way to indicate if that is the case. But I think something like that, when a film like Blade Runner 2049 fails in this respect, and people are blaming the marketing, in the future you're going to see, you're not going to see advertising campaigns that are as spoiler light as that, as teasery as that, and so it also affects things like marketing. It's not just the films that we're getting. Ben, what are your thoughts?
That's a good point. I mean, I think you guys have pretty much nailed it there. I think describing it as a thermometer is a really good way to go about it, because it's basically just indicating whether or not we're going to see a lot of the same thing. I mean, looking at the only thing that box office numbers for me are the only value that they have. They don't have a value for me as far as determining whether or not I'm going to go see something, but it's more of I guess enhancing knowing how something is performing overseas, for example. It does a really good job of sort of giving you an idea of whether or not a movie is going to be able to get a sequel that it maybe wouldn't have otherwise, because it flopped in the US. I'm thinking of Pacific Rim Uprising or something like that, where you can look at box office numbers domestically and internationally, and those tell a story as well. So maybe that sort of crafts a separate narrative of how the movie is doing than just looking at. I just can't get my mind around the idea that somebody would look at the box office receipts and say, oh, what, this movie only made $10 million this weekend? Nah, screw that. I'm not going to see it, because it's insane to me. I
want to point out that the interesting thing about Blade Runner Blade Runner 2049 is that people are kind of pointing fingers at the marketing or the fact that it's a sequel or the fact that it's not along the lines of a typical Hollywood film or the box office box office records, I'm assuming. So I know I have a lot of casual moviegoers in my family, and I know for a fact that they would not enjoy Blade Runner 2049 in the theater because it's so ambitious and so moody and slow. And I think it's a gorgeous, lovely film, but it's not a film for everyone. And I think that's interesting because we do gauge, the success of a film based off of, the financial success, and that sort of spills down to the critical and the sort of the buzz around it. But if it's not a movie that still appeals to a large number of people, I think that that was kind of the case with Blade Runner 2049. I think it's not because of marketing or box office numbers in that case. It's just because it's such an ambitious and different film that people are choosing not to see it because they know they won't enjoy it.
Fair enough.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think we've gone in depth on this box office discussion. If you have a question for us, send it to peter@slashfilm.com. Please leave your name and general geographic location. You can find more of Ben at Ben Pears on Twitter. You can find more of HT at Hoai-Tran on Twitter and the Millennial Falcon podcast. You can find me at /film. You can find all the articles discussed today on /film.com. This podcast is published every weekday on /film on iTunes, Google Play, Overcast, all the popular podcast apps. Please go to iTunes, give us a rating, give us a review, share this podcast with your friends and family, help us out, spread the word, and we'll see you tomorrow.